Hello, everyone. My name is Cristela Maldonado, and I am majoring in history and minoring in Chicanx and Latinx studies, and I'm going into my fourth year of college. And so today what I would like to focus on specifically is the 1924 National Quota Act. I want to talk about the debates that transpired in Congress about this act. I want to talk about what this act included once it was passed. And lastly, I want to talk about how it affected immigrants, specifically the immigrants that it targeted. And we'll get to that momentarily throughout this lecture. And so just to start off, I would like to give a timeline of where we're at in American history, right? What has happened so far, that events that led up to this act, right? Events that led up to people thinking when we come and talk about the debates in the following slides. And so the first thing we should know is that World War I has just come to an end in 1919. World War I, it took place in Europe, but again, the US had involvement with them. And also there were a lot of immigrants from those countries that we were fighting the war with. For example, the Germans, a lot of German immigrants were in the United States. And so there was a bit of lack of trust, so to speak. Another thing that happened was the Red Scare of 1919. And the Red Scare, just a refresher, it was basically the US government, targeting people who question capitalistic ideology. For example, if Eugene Debs rings a bell, how he was tried for being a radical, for being socialist and conspiring against the US government. And so this is kind of the climate of what is taking place, kind of the people in that society, people in that time period we're thinking about, right? And of course, this act does target immigrants, and that is what we are going to get into. And so the American people during this time, once again, held classist, discriminatory, racist notions towards immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. And eventually into the 1930s, people from the Western hemisphere as well. And so again, things were changing in American society, right? The fabric of American society, its culture, and politicians, ever so cunning, listened and instilled fear in the American people in this regard about immigration. And so I would like to highlight I would like to highlight this graph, immigration to the US by decade. And so if we look here between 1921 and 1930, and then 1931 through 1940, you see a heavy decline in immigration. And yes, part of that had to do with the Great Depression, but mostly it was also due to the quota, right? So what did the quota entail, right? That will be what I'll be sharing in the next slide. Now, there is this primary source that I got from one of my history classes, and I will note it in my bibliography at the end of this lecture. But in this primary source document, just to summarize, it's called Congress Debates Immigration Restrictions. And in summary, it is about various politicians in Congress giving their input about the quota, right, before it's passed, right, giving their input. And so some of what they talk about, some of the debates that talk about those who were for the quota and those who were not for the quota, I'll describe. So as you will know, reformers and progressive era, if that rings a bell for you. So they believed, this group of individuals, they believed that they had failed to Americanize immigrants, right? And since they had failed to Americanize them through various education programs, through work, they believed they needed to stop coming. Immigrants, these new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, needed to stop coming in such large numbers. That was one perspective, right? Some politicians and American people, they believed immigrants were unwilling to Americanize. And since they were unwilling to Americanize and apply for citizenship, they questioned their loyalty to the country. Again, we had just been through a world war, right? We had just been through a Red Scare. So the question of loyalty to the country was very much on the minds of the everyday American people. And politicians were very cunning in trying to shape that as a way of trying to defend the fabric of American society and culture during that time. And lastly, some were fearful that the new immigrants, and when I mean new immigrants, I'm talking about specifically Southern and Eastern Europeans who were coming in heavy numbers, they would bring poverty, sickness, radical political ideologies, and be subject to become public charges. Now, those who were against this act, right, these were the industrialists for the most part, right? Because they favored immigration to maintain that large pool of cheap labor, people that they would be able to exploit. Other politicians, they believed that immigration was just part of the American dream, a dream that lured many to its shores and borders, right? If our ancestors, if our families came to the United States for the American dream, why are we denying these other people from that dream as well? So that was another perspective. And lastly, some others believe that immigrants were not the root cause for poverty and for sickness in American cities, and rather it was an issue of sanitation. So this gives you a clear idea about some of the debates, some of the controversies, some of the perspectives that some of these politicians had when debating the act. Now, what did the act entail? This is what it ended up being, right? The 1924 National Quota Act. So the debates that I just shared with you, right? Those debates were taking place in 1920. And finally, it was passed in 1924 and it was set in place. And so they set numerical limits, as you can see on the slide. They set qualitative limits, 2% of each national group based on foreign born in the US, right? And they decided to use the ethnic heritage of US people based on the 1890 census, the year before Eastern European peoples came in large numbers. So before 1819, the US was fairly Northern European. After 1890, that is where more Southern and Eastern European people from Italy, from Slovak countries, from Russia were coming into the United States. And Asian people of Asian descent, were ineligible for citizenship. If you recall the Chinese Exclusion Act and also the Gentleman's Agreement. So since they would never be allowed to gain citizenship in the United States, the quota basically banned them. But it did allow Western immigration, and that is where the flow of Western hemisphere countries and populations, people from Latin America, started to come in bigger numbers. The law also reshaped the face of the nation towards a more Northern European America. That was ultimately, kind of the goal, right? And it just embedded racial and cultural quotas on the United States, limiting it to Northern Europeans and not Southern and Eastern Europeans, because they were thought to be inferior, and of course also people of Asian descent during this time. And so again, this quota just really highlights the racist and classist and notions of superiority that the national quota instilled in the US, how it was debated and then implemented. But of course, as the Depression comes through, and also when World War II just kind of makes America, like, slowly over time, this national quota kind of chips away, but it wasn't entirely chipped away until we had another reform in 1965. And this is The Source, Congress Debates Restrictions by the Simpson Reader. I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you for listening.